What happens when two of the most outspoken figures in entertainment and royalty collide on live television? You won't believe what unfolds when Prince Harry sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, but quickly spirals into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted into a full-blown verbal warfare that left studio audiences gasping and producers scrambling to maintain control. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below. Because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses go head-to-head in a battle of wits that nobody saw coming. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had been riding high on ratings, but nothing could have prepared viewers for the dramatic showdown that unfolded last night. What started as standard celebrity banter quickly devolved into a heated exchange that exposed the raw nerves and hidden tensions between America's most satirical host and Britain's most controversial royal. The evening began like any other taping at the Ed Sullivan Theatre. Prince Harry had arrived to promote his latest charitable initiative, looking relaxed in his signature casual blazer and jeans combination. The audience was buzzing with excitement. Cameras were rolling, and Stephen Colbert emerged with his trademark confident stride and mischievous grin. The initial pleasantries seemed genuine enough. Handshakes, smiles, and the usual late-night television choreography that audiences have come to expect. But seasoned Colbert watchers could sense something different in the host's demeanor from the moment he launched into his opening monologue. His jokes carried an extra edge, his timing was more aggressive, and there was a particular gleam in his eye that suggested he had something special planned for his royal guest. The audience laughed along, unaware that they were about to witness television history in the making. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Prince Harry," Colbert announced with his characteristic theatrical flourish, but there was something almost predatory in his smile as the Duke of Sussex made his way to the guest chair. The applause was enthusiastic, the lights were bright, and everything appeared perfectly normal on the surface. Harry settled into his seat with practiced ease, having navigated countless interviews since stepping back from royal duties. He flashed his charming smile at the audience and exchanged what seemed like friendly banter with Colbert about the New York weather and his flight from California. The conversation felt natural, almost rehearsed in its politeness, but beneath the surface, both men were sizing each other up like prize fighters in the opening round. "So, Harry," Colbert began, leaning forward with that infamous interviewer's lean that signaled he was about to dig deeper. "You've been quite vocal about your family situation, your struggles with the media, your new life in America. Some people might say you've been, let's call it oversharing about very private family matters. How do you respond to critics who suggest you're exploiting your royal connections for personal gain?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere. Harry's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he composed himself, but that momentary crack was enough to reveal that Colbert had struck a nerve right out of the gate. "I think that's a rather unfair characterization, Stephen," Harry replied, his British accent becoming more pronounced as it often did when he felt defensive. "Everything I've shared has been in service of helping others who might be going through similar struggles. Mental health, family dysfunction, the pressures of public life. These are universal human experiences." But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, Harry's measured response seemed to embolden him further. Universal human experiences, sure, but not everyone gets to monetize their family drama through multi-million-dollar book deals and Netflix contracts. I mean, you've essentially built a brand around being the victim of your own privilege. Some might call that ironic. The word ironic dripped with Colbert's signature sarcasm, and the studio audience let out a collective gasp. This wasn't the gentle ribbing that late-night guests typically endured. This was something much more pointed, much more personal. Harry's jaw tightened visibly, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair with increasing tension. "I think you're misunderstanding the intention behind everything we've done," Harry said, his voice remaining steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "When you grow up in an institution that prioritizes image over truth, that protects certain members while throwing others under the bus, you have a responsibility to speak out. That's not victimhood, Stephen. That's accountability." The mention of being thrown under the bus seemed to strike a chord with Colbert, whose own relationship with institutional power and media criticism had been well documented throughout his career. But instead of finding common ground, the host doubled down on his aggressive approach. Accountability, Colbert repeated, practically savoring the word. That's interesting coming from someone who walked away from all responsibilities when things got tough. I mean, you took the crown jewels of royal training, the education, the connections, the platform, and then decided to cash out when the going got rough. And now you're lecturing the rest of us about accountability? The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Audience members were looking around nervously, unsure whether this was part of some elaborate comedic bit or if they were witnessing a genuine conflict unfold in real time. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every micro-expression, every pause, every moment of escalating hostility between the two men. Harry leaned forward in his chair, his diplomatic training warring with his obvious frustration. You know what, Stephen? I think you're being deliberately obtuse here. You've built your entire career on criticizing institutions, on holding power accountable, on speaking truth to authority. But when someone actually does that, when someone actually walks away from a corrupt system and tries to build something better, you attack them for it. Oh, I'm being obtuse. Colbert shot back, his voice rising slightly. I've spent my career going after politicians and corporations and actual centers of power. You've spent years going after your grandmother and your father on international television. There's a bit of a difference there, wouldn't you say? The mention of his family members by name seemed to be the final straw for Harry. His composure, which had been hanging by a thread throughout the exchange, finally began to crack. The prince, who had spent years learning to navigate hostile press conferences and diplomatic tensions, was clearly struggling to maintain his cool in the face of Colbert's relentless assault. You don't know what you're talking about, Harry said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than if he had shouted. You don't know what it's like to have your entire life controlled by people who care more about headlines than your happiness. You don't know what it's like to watch the institution you were born into actively work against your wife, your children, your mental health. But Colbert was just getting started, and the gloves were about to come off completely. The host leaned back in his chair with the predatory satisfaction of someone who had found their target's weak spot and was preparing to exploit it mercilessly. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, casting harsh shadows across both men's faces as the confrontation entered dangerous territory. What had started as professional sparring was rapidly transforming into something much more personal and volatile. Let me get this straight, Colbert continued, his voice dripping with theatrical incredulity. You're sitting here, in America, having fled your responsibilities, living in a mansion in Montecito, and you want us to believe you're some kind of freedom fighter? You've turned family dysfunction into a cottage industry, Harry. Every interview, every documentary, every book chapter is just another way to monetize your mommy issues and your daddy problems. The mention of his parents hit Harry like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and for a moment, the carefully constructed public persona that he had spent years perfecting completely evaporated. The audience could sense they were witnessing something unprecedented, a member of the British royal family losing composure on live American television. How dare you? Harry whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying the kind of rage that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. How dare you reduce my mother's death, my family's trauma, to some kind of marketing strategy? You think this is a game? You think I chose any of this? But Colbert, sensing blood in the water, pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency that had made him one of television's most feared interviewers. I think you've made a choice to air your family's dirty laundry for profit while hiding behind noble causes and mental health advocacy. It's brilliant marketing, really. Package your revenge tour as therapy, and suddenly criticism becomes cruelty. The word revenge seemed to unlock something primal in Harry. He stood up abruptly from his chair, towering over the seated host, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The sudden movement caused a ripple of gasps throughout the studio audience, and security personnel could be seen shifting nervously in the shadows beyond the cameras. Revenge. Harry's voice cracked with emotion. You want to talk about revenge, Stephen? Let's talk about how you've built your entire career on tearing people down, on making jokes about other people's pain, on turning human suffering into punchlines for your audience's entertainment. At least I'm trying to help people. What are you doing besides feeding off the misery of others? The accusation struck home harder than Colbert had expected. His signature smirk faltered for the first time since the interview began, replaced by something darker, more defensive. The host, who had spent decades perfecting the art of satirical takedowns, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of a royal verbal assault. I help people by holding power accountable, Colbert shot back, rising from his own chair to match Harry's aggressive posture. I go after presidents, senators, CEOs, people who actually affect policy and lives. You go after your own family members who can't fight back because of protocol and tradition. There's a difference between punching up and punching down, Your Highness. The deliberate use of the royal title was clearly meant as an insult, and it worked. Harry's eyes blazed with fury as he stepped closer to Colbert's desk, the physical distance between them shrinking as the emotional chasm widened into an unbridgeable gulf. Protocol and tradition? Harry laughed bitterly. You mean the same protocol and tradition that protected my Uncle Andrew while destroying my wife's mental health? The same institution that leaked stories about a 2-year-old having tantrums to distract from their own scandals? You want to defend that system, Stephen? You want to be their attack dog? The mention of specific family scandals and his wife seemed to shift something in the studio atmosphere. This wasn't just a heated interview anymore. This was a full-scale emotional breakdown happening in real time, with millions of viewers watching a prince unravel under the hot lights of late-night television. Colbert, perhaps sensing he had pushed too far but unable to back down now, decided to go for the killing blow. I'm not anyone's attack dog, Harry, but at least I don't bite the hand that fed me for 30 years and then cry about it on Oprah. You want to know what I think? I think you're scared. Scared that without the royal drama, without the family conflict, you're just another privileged celebrity with nothing interesting to say. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Harry went completely still, his breathing shallow and rapid. The camera operators zoomed in instinctively, capturing the moment when a man who had been trained from birth to never show weakness in public completely lost control. You don't know anything about fear, Harry said, his voice now completely steady in that terrifying way that suggested he was beyond anger, beyond hurt, beyond caring about consequences. You sit behind this desk every night, making jokes about real people's real pain, and you think that makes you brave? You think that makes you important? You're nothing but a glorified court jester, Stephen. At least I had the courage to walk away. The comparison to a court jester visibly stung Colbert, whose face reddened with rage. Years of criticism about his role as a late-night comedian, questions about his relevance and impact, suddenly came flooding back in the face of this royal dismissal. Court jester. Colbert's voice rose to a near shout. I've interviewed presidents, covered elections, shaped political discourse in this country for decades. You've given a few interviews and written a book. We are not the same, Harry. We are. Not even close to the same. You're right, Harry replied with deadly calm. We're not the same. I walked away from power when I realized it was corrupt. You've spent your career desperately trying to get close to it. You invite politicians on this show, you make them laugh, you make them comfortable, and you think that makes you a journalist? You're not holding anyone accountable, Stephen. You're entertaining them. The accusation of being entertainment rather than journalism struck at the core of Colbert's professional identity. The host, who had spent years trying to bridge the gap between comedy and serious political commentary, suddenly found himself being dismissed as irrelevant by someone he had expected to easily dominate. At least I'm consistent, Colbert fired back, his composure completely shattered now. At least I don't pretend to be something I'm not. You want to play the victim? Fine. You want to cash in on your trauma? Fine. But don't stand there and lecture me about integrity when you've turned your entire family into content for your media empire. The studio audience was now completely silent, afraid to even breathe as they watched two powerful men destroy each other with words. This had gone far beyond entertainment, far beyond professional interviewing, into something raw and personal, and potentially damaging for both participants. Harry took another step closer to the desk, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. My family turned me into content long before I ever said a word publicly. The difference is, I'm finally telling my side of the story instead of letting them control the narrative. But you wouldn't understand that, would you, Stephen? You've never had to fight for your own truth. The personal nature of the attack seemed to unlock something desperate in Colbert, who found himself fighting not just for dominance in this interview, but for his entire sense of professional worth and personal identity. My truth. Colbert laughed harshly. Your truth is a multi-million-dollar Netflix deal and a best-selling memoir. My truth is showing up here every night, doing the work, earning my place instead of being born into it. So forgive me if I don't have much sympathy for your struggle to find yourself in a $40 million mansion. The financial details seemed to push Harry over an edge he hadn't even known existed. His carefully controlled facade finally crumbled completely, and what emerged was something raw and dangerous that no media training could have prepared him for. $40 million. Harry's voice exploded through the studio with a fury that made everyone present flinch. You want to talk about money, Stephen? Let's talk about your CBS contract. Let's talk about how much you make every year sitting behind this desk, making jokes about people suffering while pretending you're some kind of moral authority. At least I'm honest about what I'm doing. At least I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. The mention of his CBS contract hit Colbert like a slap across the face. His carefully constructed persona as the everyman comedian taking on the establishment suddenly felt exposed and hypocritical under Harry's withering assault. The host's face contorted with rage as years of pent-up criticism about his own wealth and privilege came flooding back. Don't you dare, Colbert snarled, pointing an accusatory finger directly at Harry's chest. Don't you dare try to flip this around. I earned every penny I've made. I started from nothing, worked my way up through comedy clubs and cable television, built my career from scratch. You were born with a silver spoon so far up your ass you could taste the royal crest. The crude language sent shock waves through the studio. This was live television, prime time, and one of America's most respected late-night hosts had just completely abandoned any pretense of professionalism. The audience gasped audibly, some covering their mouths in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Harry's eyes blazed with an intensity that bordered on volcanic. Born with a silver spoon? You think growing up in that prison was a privilege? You think watching your mother get hunted by photographers until it killed her was some kind of gift? You think having every moment of your childhood dissected by tabloids was lucky? You have no idea what you're talking about, Stephen. No idea at all. The raw pain in Harry's voice cut through the anger, revealing something deeper and more devastating than simple rage. For a moment, the studio fell into complete silence as everyone present was forced to confront the human cost of the spectacle they were witnessing. But Colbert, too far gone to pull back now, pressed forward with cruel precision. Boo-hoo, Colbert said with vicious sarcasm. Poor little Prince had a hard childhood. You know what most people with hard childhoods do, Harry? They go to therapy quietly. They work through their issues. They try to build better lives. They don't write tell-all books and give revenge interviews to destroy the people who raised them. The word revenge again seemed to act like a trigger for Harry. Something snapped inside him with an almost audible crack, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a cold, calculated fury that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier explosions. You want revenge, Stephen? Let me tell you about revenge. Revenge is watching your family leak stories about your wife's mental health struggles to distract from their own scandals. Revenge is having your own father choose his public image over his son's happiness. Revenge is being told to keep quiet while they destroy everything you love to protect an institution that doesn't give a damn about any of us. Harry moved around the desk now, invading Colbert's personal space in a way that made the host instinctively step backward. The power dynamic in the studio had completely shifted, with the prince now looming over the comedian who had started this confrontation. But you know what real revenge looks like? Harry continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent studio. Real revenge is walking away. Real revenge is refusing to play their game anymore. Real revenge is building something better and watching them scramble to stay relevant without you. Colbert, backed against his own desk, seemed to realize for the first time that he had awakened something he couldn't control. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Even his sweat beaded on his forehead and his hands shook slightly. Is that what you call what you've built? Colbert's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed forward. A podcast empire based on complaining. About your relatives? A brand built on being the royal family's biggest victim? That's your big revenge, Harry. That's your contribution to the world. The mockery proved to be the final straw. Harry straightened to his full height, towering over the seated host with a presence that suddenly reminded everyone in the studio that despite everything, this man was still a prince, still carried centuries of royal blood and breeding that no amount of California casual wear could disguise. My contribution? Harry's voice was now deadly calm, each word precisely enunciated with the kind of aristocratic authority that had been bred into him since birth. My contribution is showing people that they don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from family. My contribution is proving that you can walk away from toxic situations, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. My contribution is giving other people permission to choose their own happiness over everyone else's expectations. He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering his final blow. What's your contribution, Stephen? Making people laugh while the world burns? Giving politicians a friendly platform to seem relatable while they destroy democracy? At least when I talk about my family, I'm trying to heal something. When you talk about other people's families, you're just trying to get ratings. The accusation hit Colbert with devastating accuracy. Every criticism he had ever faced about the superficiality of late-night comedy, every question about whether entertainment was an adequate response to serious political crises, suddenly crystallized. In this moment of confrontation, his face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, hurt, rage, and finally something like resignation. "Get out," Colbert said quietly, his voice barely audible above the studio's ventilation system. "What?" Harry asked, though he had heard perfectly. "I said get out," Colbert repeated, louder this time, his finger pointing toward the studio exit. "Get out of my studio. Get out of my show. This interview is over." Harry looked around the studio, taking in the shocked faces of the audience, the bewildered expressions of the crew members, the cameras that were still rolling and capturing every moment of this unprecedented meltdown. A slow smile spread across his face, not of happiness, but of vindication. "No, Stephen," Harry said with quiet dignity, straightening his jacket and running a hand through his hair. "I'm not getting thrown out. I'm walking out. There's a difference." He turned toward the audience, many of whom were still sitting in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time tonight. I hope you've learned something about the difference between entertainment and truth, between comedy and courage." With that, Prince Harry turned on his heel and walked toward the studio exit with the measured pace of someone who had finally taken control of his own narrative. Each step echoed through the silent studio as he made his way past shocked crew members and bewildered producers who were scrambling to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. As Harry reached the exit, he paused and turned back one final time to face Colbert, who was still standing behind his desk, looking smaller somehow than he had at the beginning of the evening. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen?" Harry called out across the studio, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "You had a chance tonight to have a real conversation about real issues that matter to real people. Instead, you chose to be exactly what everyone expects from American television: shallow, cruel, and ultimately meaningless." And with that final devastating assessment, Prince Harry pushed through the studio doors and disappeared into the New York night, leaving behind a studio full of people who were still trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Stephen Colbert stood alone behind his desk, the hot lights beating down on him, facing an audience that didn't know whether to applaud, boo, or simply leave. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of his humiliation, every second of the silence that stretched on far too long. Finally, Colbert turned to his audience with a forced smile that fooled absolutely no one. "Well," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting, that's our show for tonight. Prince Harry, everyone, give him a hand." But the applause, when it came, was scattered and uncertain, more obligation than enthusiasm. And as the show's credits began to roll over the chaos of the studio, everyone present knew they had witnessed something that would be talked about, analyzed, and remembered long after the lights had dimmed and the cameras had stopped rolling. The confrontation was over, but its consequences were just beginning.